I'm Helen Lawson, TASO's Research Programs Manager, and I'm facilitating today's webinar. Presenting today, we have Rain Sherlock, who is our Evaluation Manager, and Sarah Chappell, who is our Senior Research Officer. And without further ado, I will hand you over to Rain.
Super, thank you, Helen. So yeah, welcome everyone. Good to have lots of you here. Today we are going to talk you through kind of an introduction to randomized control trials, both the theory and the background, and then also a practical example. So you can see here how our session is going to run. We've kind of done a quick welcome and intro. I am going to cover the theory and background, so I'll speak for kind of probably 35 minutes, and then hand over to Sarah for the second half of the webinar to talk you through the Summer Schools project and some very early findings that we have. And then, as Helen has mentioned, we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end. So please do drop your questions as you go, or jot them down, and we'll come to them in a little bit. So I think lots of people will have seen this slide and kind of heard the preamble before, but I do like to start these webinars with kind of situating us within what we call the evaluation cycle. So at TASO, we think of evaluation as kind of iterative or circular, with each of these four phases kind of informing the development of the next phase. So we start with diagnose and development of a theory of change. We move on to plan, where we think through our kind of research questions and the methodologies that we're using. We then think about how to measure those questions, so collect data and the type of analysis that we use. And then, of course, in the final phase, the sort of reflection and dissemination of our findings. Today's session is situated within plan. So we're going to be talking about randomized control trials, which are one methodology available to us, one approach to evaluation that is an option as we plan our research or evaluation. I also often use this slide to help kind of situate where we are in terms of the evidence landscape. So it's worth noting that TASO aligns to the OFS, the Office for Students Standards of Evidence, which you can see here on screen in this little diagram. And for those of you who also align to the OFS or have a kind of access and participation plan, I think it's worth kind of noting where we are. So we've got good type 1 evidence. I think many people are using kind of theories of change. We have good narrative evidence. We're able to describe the interventions that we're doing, the programs that we run, and what we intend their impact to be. I think we have some type 2 evidence, which we call kind of more empirical research. We're getting better at collecting data and estimating correlations. We're getting better at kind of thinking about the counterfactual and comparison groups. And then I think we're basically still missing the kind of type 3 or causal evidence within the HE sector in our kind of current landscape. So what we would call causal evidence or research and evaluation that allows us to draw causal inference. And this is really where RCTs come in, randomized control trials. So they are a methodology that typically allows us to get at causality, this kind of cause and effects relationship. That said, I've added this slide because I also think it's worth pausing and reflecting on the fact that RCTs are just one tool in our toolbox, or one kind of methodology available to us. There's a number of approaches that we use for evaluation and for research, and many of them complement each other and kind of can be used alongside each other. And I think as researchers, we need to be kind of adaptable to pulling in what's most useful at any given time. So randomized control trials serve a purpose. They're very useful for this kind of causal attribution, causal research. But we need to be flexible and open to using different methodologies. And particularly with randomized control trials, we need to think about kind of pairing them with, or also using qualitative research. So perhaps as part of an implementation and process evaluation, which we sometimes call IPE. And then, of course, theories of change. We start most evaluations with a theory of change and would also couple that with an RCT. So theory and background to randomized control trials. I'm going to start with a very brief kind of whistle-stop tour of the history. I think this might be familiar to some people. They seem to be names that kind of sprout up a lot, but often RCTs are tracked back to about 1747, when James Lind, who was a Scottish doctor, started trying to treat scurvy. So he randomized people into different treatment groups, and he tried to understand what might remedy scurvy with things like, I think, kind of seawater, nutmeg, maybe even cider, and then obviously citrus fruit, which we now know is a treatment and prevention for scurvy. Another significant point that science often acknowledges is the, I think, 1863 Austin Flint. He was an American doctor, I believe, and he was one of the first, if not the first, to start using the placebo. So again, would randomize people into kind of treatment, control, and placebo, and start, the literature on placebo tracked back to Austin Flint. We then come to 1943. So this is when the UK Medical Research Council conducted its first double-blinded comparative trial with a treatment and control. So it was beginning to see the idea of randomization into different groups becoming more sophisticated in how it's done, and also more widespread given the kind of medical sphere at the moment. By 1943, we hadn't quite got as far as social science. But if we then fast forward to where we are today, we have, I think, over 1 million and maybe even more by now registered clinical trials in the UK. And obviously we're increasingly using randomization and RCTs for social sciences. So we see it in education, social work, healthcare, etc. So to look at a couple of examples of where RCTs have allowed us as researchers or social scientists to observe causal evidence of an intervention working well. There are loads of examples of this, particularly in the US literature, and I've tried to just pick a couple that feel relatable to us and our work in HE. So one example is a US study focused on expanding college opportunities, particularly for high achieving but low income students. So I think previous research or kind of existing literature has suggested that a kind of majority, so a large proportion of high achieving low income students were unlikely to be reached by traditional methods for informing students about how to make an application, how to finance or fund an application, etc. So this study used a randomized control trial to test the impact of personalized information on the college application process. So it allocated students obviously into kind of intervention or treatment and control, and students who were in the intervention group received customized, so personalized information as part of a portal, helping them understand how they personally could apply to or put in an application for college. And then the control group just received the usual information, so it wasn't personalized or tailored in any way. And what we saw here is that the high achieving but low income group of students, so our kind of target audience, submitted 19% more applications, and those applications were actually accepted into 12% more colleges than those that didn't receive the information. So this is just an example of how an RCT has allowed us to create a kind of causal understanding of how the personalized information contributed to a change in outcomes, so applications, number of applications, and also submissions into HE, into college. The second example is an RCT that was run in India, again on educational outcomes. So this was a partnership with an education NGO in India, and again researchers, I think, in the US. And they wanted to trial a kind of low cost, what they call a remedial education program. It was actually a tutoring program in a school in India. So they had 200 schools on board. Again, they randomly allocated a tutor to schools that were in the intervention group, and then schools who were in the control group didn't receive the tutor. The tutors, I guess, because it's helpful information, the tutors were like teaching staff, so not necessarily like peers or students that were already at university, but they were kind of professional teaching staff. And again, the results of the tutoring program showed that the students who received a tutor had an increase in attainment of level 3 grades in India. So they took level 3 grades for the intervention group and the control group, and those who were in the intervention and received the tutor had a significant effect. And this program, I think, was actually deemed so successful that they have rolled it out across different districts in India, and it's now become a kind of national tutoring program. So again, just a way or an example of how RCTs have allowed us to better understand the relationship between our activity, our program, our intervention, and the outcome that we're interested in. Also want to spend a moment here thinking about studies or examples of where randomized control trials have allowed us to observe an intervention that does not work. So these are two more well-known or kind of widely discussed studies or trials. So the one on the left here is called Scared Straights, and this was a program run in the US that organized visits to prisons or prison facilities for children or young people that were at risk of offending or criminal activity. So the idea being, if we've got students who, for whatever reason, give early indicators that they may end up offending, we introduce them to the prison system, to the facilities, and the idea is that they will kind of experience what it's like, and then it will deter them from any criminal activity in the future. So researchers set this up as a randomized control trial. People were randomized into an intervention group and a control group. Obviously, those in the intervention did visit the prison facilities and those in the control did not. But actually what it found is that visiting the prisons was not only not going to deter people from committing crime, so it didn't have the intended impact that it hoped, but actually those in the treatment group were more likely to end up offending later than those in the control group. So it backfired in terms of what the intended impact was meant to be. What we observed was actually the opposite. Another example of something similar but slightly less clear results is the unconscious bias training. Again, some people might be familiar with this, but it is a kind of once-off training course or training activity. The idea being that by going through an unconscious bias training, we're able to help sort of humans as irrational thinkers to overcome unconscious bias. So when we sift CVs as part of a recruitment process, or we are doing research on different populations, there is evidence to suggest that an unconscious bias can take over our kind of locus of control. So we might unconsciously bias based on gender or kind of other factors or variables. And what the findings from RCTs run on this trial has found is that actually giving people information about their unconscious bias isn't enough to combat the effect. So this training doesn't have an impact on whether or not people become less biased. I think previously this training has been used quite a lot across government and different sectors, but due to the evidence that's emerging now based on these trials, the UK government's actually decided to stop using it because it's not a good use of kind of time, money, or resource, given that it doesn't have an impact. So what I'm trying to point out in all of these examples, I guess, is that RCTs allow us to test hypotheses. So we have a kind of theory behind the change that we expect to see. And by running an RCT, we have the confidence to kind of estimate a causal effect. So does the intervention impact the outcome or the behavior that we're interested in? And you can see examples of where it has and examples of where it hasn't. And so it's really important that we understand this causal relationship, or we kind of build this evidence bank so that we can make more impactful decisions on the type of activity or programs that we run, but also to save money, time, and resource, right? There's just no point doing something that's costing a lot and not having the impact that we expect it to. Alrighty, so coming to the kind of basic RCT. So what, in all of these examples that we've just gone through, what is it that we're actually talking about, and how does it work? So what you can see on screen here is the most kind of basic concept of an RCT, I guess. So we take our population, which is the big circle on the left-hand side, and is the kind of sample of people that we're interested to examine or study or investigate. And we randomly assign them to two groups. So the intervention group at the top here, and then the control group at the bottom. And then over time, we will measure the key outcome that we're interested in, or observe the behavior that we're interested in between the two groups. And we will be able to establish whether there is any difference for the main outcome between the intervention and the control group. So Sarah is going to talk you through a summer schools example in lots of detail later, but just quickly to kind of situate us here, the sample population on the left would be everyone that we're interested to examine or study, so the whole kind of sample. We would then randomly assign people either to receive a summer school at the top or to not receive a summer school at the bottom. And then on the far right hand side, we would observe them over time and try to understand how many of those students end up in higher education. So the little red dots would represent the people who do, and the green dots would represent the people who don't. Now, one of the key things that the control group gives us, or the kind of unique thing about an RCT, is that it allows us to observe what we call the counterfactual. So the counterfactual is kind of simply what would happen if we hadn't done the thing, if we hadn't implemented the summer school, implemented the intervention, changed the information, etc. So it's just what would happen if the condition of the intervention wasn't present. And by introducing the control, we're able to observe that in a way that some other methodologies don't allow us to. So statistical power, I guess a kind of caveat up front is that we aren't going to go into loads of detail on power. I know we kind of referenced it in previous TASO webinars, and I'm definitely promising a whole session on power at some point because it does require a full hour really. However, we can't really give a whole session on RCTs and not mention power. So I'm going to give you a quick overview and hopefully it's enough to get us through today, but don't worry if it does also feel a little overwhelming because it is something that should and will have a full hour at a later point. Essentially, to be able to conduct a randomized control trial, we need to think about statistical power. And statistical power is a measure of likelihood. So it's just, or it's kind of essentially the likelihood that a researcher will find statistical significance in a sample if that effect does actually exist in the real world, the real population. So I sometimes think of statistical power or power as the kind of the muscle that we need to be able to detect a difference between the two groups that we're studying, so the treatment and control, and ensure that we don't miss finding any differences. So accidentally think that the effect doesn't exist just because we've missed it in the group that we're observing. So what you can see on the slide here is that power is a function of 3 primary factors at the bottom and then 1 secondary factor. So the primary factors are obviously sample size, so how many people are we studying, the effect size, so how big is the effect or the impact of what we're trying to implement as an intervention or activity, and then what we call the significance level or the P level, so the P value. And then of course we also need to understand the power of the statistic used. So are we using a t-test, are we using a regression, are we using a chi-squared test, and what's the power of that? Now in our world, because we're working with real life students and we can't kind of endlessly recruit to our trials, we usually have a kind of set sample of the students that exist in a context that we're observing. We can't just increase our sample as we like and recruit to our trial until we reach the number that we want in the way that some social scientists or social researchers can. Because of this, power becomes quite a serious consideration when we're setting up trials, and this is definitely relevant to the example that Sarah will talk through later with summer schools. So we need to have an adequate sample size, as well as all the other factors on this slide, obviously, to be able to run a trial properly or in a robust way. And being underpowered is risky and definitely not advised because it means that we're vulnerable to what we call a type 1 error, which is also sometimes called a false negative, and quite simply means that we fail to detect a true effect or a true kind of difference in our outcome when actually that difference does exist. And that's quite simply because we just don't have enough people in our sample to observe it. So we typically power our trials to 80% or 0.8. Don't worry, you don't need to kind of remember that now. And really what this means is that if we were to run a trial over and over again, 1 in 5 times, we would still not find the effect that we're hoping to observe because we're only powered to that 80% and 20% is still not accounted for. If we reduce the power, so if we were to power ourselves to like 50 or 40%, we increase the likelihood of not detecting that true effect and observing a false negative. So you can see why, in order to observe an effect that does exist in the larger kind of wide population, we need to be well powered. Essentially, that means we need to have a sample size that's big enough. I hope that doesn't leave people too confused, but also if it does, don't worry. As I said, we will share readings later, happy to take questions on it, and we'll also do a proper session on this at some point in the near future. So let's think through a couple of reasons or the different explanations behind why we randomize and why randomization is useful. So the first is because randomization allows us to control for individual differences. So by randomly allocating people to an intervention or a treatment and a control group, we can say that any difference in the outcome or the behavior that we're observing between the two groups is caused by the intervention. So the thing that we did or the thing that we changed is what caused the outcome to change. And that's quite simply because everything else between the groups is on average the same. And by randomizing into treatment and control, we have the confidence that they are on average the same. This is in line with the law of large numbers, which comes back to sample size, I guess. Essentially, it works with big populations. So if we have lots and lots of people, small fluctuations or any kind of small differences are going to be ironed out over the course of the whole population because there are so many people. If we were studying really small groups, so kind of 2 or 3 people in treatment or 2 or 3 people in control, any of those small differences or small variances wouldn't be ironed out. So they would have quite an impact on the outcome that we're interested to measure. So essentially, by randomizing, we can assume that the treatment and control are on average the same. And that is the beauty of randomization and one of the kind of key things. The second reason here is that randomization allows us to control for external or sometimes what we call unexpected factors in the control group. So again, when we randomly allocate people from our sample to both intervention or control, we can have confidence that the groups are similarly vulnerable to anything that's happening in the external world or the external environment, anything that might impact the outcome that we're interested in over time. I was struggling to think of an example here, and I hope this one is kind of intuitive and makes sense, but essentially, if you imagine that we are running a trial that promotes healthy breakfast for school-aged children. So you can see those in the intervention group on the left-hand side here would get kind of information and training on what a healthy breakfast can do for our children. But at the same time, and coincidentally, we didn't know this, there's a sort of national TV and radio campaign going on that's also promoting healthy eating for school-aged children, but also for the population in general. So there's just a big kind of push for healthy eating. Well, because we will randomly allocate people to our intervention and control, we can assume that the likelihood of them seeing or hearing the national campaign about healthy eating is the same for both groups. Now, if you imagine for a moment that we hadn't randomized, so maybe we had let parents and school-aged children self-select and kind of join the trial if they wanted to, it's very possible that we end up in a scenario where those who opted into the trial are already quite health conscious, maybe already seek out information about healthy eating. They might actually be involved in that national campaign that's going on because they've already got an interest in healthy eating. And so this is likely to kind of bias the group that end up in the treatment. Essentially, what I'm saying here is that having a control group and the nature of randomly allocating people to these two groups allows us to neutralize external factors. So we can assume that both groups are equally vulnerable to those external factors that might happen over time. The third and kind of final key reason then for why we randomize is that, and I should say when it's applied correctly, and again, linking back to power, but assuming that it is applied correctly and it is well powered, it allows us to estimate causal effect of our interventions. So we have activity or program A, and we can say with confidence that it has a causal link to outcome or behavior B. So this ability to estimate the causal effect, or to sometimes we would refer to that as infer causality. It really means the same thing. That is due to the random assignment of study participants. So all similarities and differences between groups are assumed to exist by chance. And the reason that we use randomization is to account for these confounding variables. So both measured and unmeasured variables are accounted for when we use randomization. So a little kind of I guess refresh or recap here. What does all of this mean in terms of us being able to answer our research questions or our evaluation questions? So the first circle on the left here, do RCTs tell us what works? The simple answer is yes, they do. So RCTs are a kind of what works solution. So by using an RCT, we can establish the relationship between the intervention X on outcome or behavior Y. And as we saw a moment ago, RCTs allow us to estimate that causal effect. Do RCTs tell us why the intervention works? So I think there's a bit of a question mark here. Essentially, sometimes they do or they can. So we can design RCTs in a way that help us understand why things work. We do this by using interactions or different conditions that isolate a certain mechanism. But broadly, RCTs are best suited to tell us what works. And then finally, do RCTs tell us how it works? I think the simple answer is no, they don't. Some people may argue that and may know more than I do. I think with kind of very elegantly designed trials with different interactions and controls, you can begin to get at the how. So yeah, feel free to drop information in the chat or come back to us later in the Q&A if you know more about that. But essentially, RCTs are not well suited to telling us how it works. And so again, I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is that as researchers and evaluators, we have this whole toolkit. RCTs are one tool in that toolkit. They're very good at answering the what works. They're less good at answering the why works. And I would argue that it's difficult for them to answer the how it works. And this is where we need to think about the other methodologies that we use. So I briefly mentioned implementation and process evaluation, which is something that we definitely strongly recommend running alongside an RCT. And that the IPE, the kind of abbreviation or acronym, will help us understand the why and how in a way that the RCT doesn't or can't. So it wouldn't be a session on RCTs without a Torgerson and Torgerson quote. Some of you might know of Torgerson. You might have read there's an excellent book called, I think it's just called Designing Randomized Trials, which I frequently revisit and revisited when preparing for this session. But what they say here, and I have to say I think I agree, is that the beauty of randomization is that it controls for the known measurable variables, the known unmeasurable variables, and most importantly, the unknown and unmeasurable variables that could affect our outcome. Yeah, definitely recommend visiting their book if you haven't done. So to pause and reflect on the basic kind of pros and cons or benefits and limitations of a basic RCT, I should say this isn't the kind of wrap up. We're then going to go through in quite a lot of detail all the different ways to randomize. But in terms of the most basic design that we've talked through, there's obviously a number of benefits. Some of these we've got at already. So it's the most rigorous method for addressing the counterfactual. It allows us to observe what would have happened if we hadn't implemented the intervention or changed the thing that we're working on. It's an ideal tool for causal inference, or this idea about kind of causal effect. So due to the ability of an RCT to control for the unknown and unmeasurable variables, we're able to deter causal inference. It's helpful in determining whether or not an intervention works. So RCTs allow us to establish how big the effect is and whether the value add is worthwhile. So rooting ourselves in summer schools, again, if we were to implement a summer school and observe that it only got 2 more students into higher education, we'd be able to basically evaluate for ourselves whether or not the value add is worth it. Whereas if we were to run a summer school and it got 200 students into education, again, we'd be able to do a kind of value adds estimation. And the good thing, or the kind of beauty of RCTs, is the size of that effect is observable. Experiments typically have high internal validity, so the extent to which you can be confident that a cause and effect relationship is not explainable by kind of external variables or confounding variables means that we have high internal validity. And then it also allows us to address the selection bias. So people are not self-selecting or kind of self-opting into the trial, they're being randomly allocated, which means that we account for that bias that sometimes exists in other methodologies. As with all tools in our toolkit, RCTs also come with a number of limitations. So there are ethical considerations around not giving the intervention to all groups, so the control group typically don't get that intervention. There are some ways to kind of manage or navigate this. And I think Sarah's going to come on to this in a little bit more detail later, but often we have programs or activities that are oversubscribed. So there's only a set amount of places anyway, and some students won't be able to take part. Randomization is a good way to allocate places in this scenario rather than a kind of first come, first serve basis. We also have something called Equipoise in ethics. Quite simply, Equipoise is the kind of idea that we don't actually have evidence on what works yet. So there's no real understanding of whether it's the treatment or the control that's better. And so therefore we're just randomizing people into two groups without knowing whether or not one group is going to be missing out on something that might work, which helps us kind of dig into and understand the ethics in a bit more detail. RCTs can be time consuming and expensive, definitely a limitation that needs to be considered. We also have something called the Hawthorne effect, and linked to that is kind of internal validity concerns. So if people know that they're part of an RCT, it can affect their behavior if they think they're being studied or examined, and that's definitely something we need to bear in mind. It can be difficult to randomize participants. Oh, a Z has crept in there. I've gone through and tried to combat the Americanism, but you might see a few Zs. So we will come on to this in much more detail, the kind of difficulty with randomizing. We're going to spend some time on that in a moment. And then, of course, the inverse of the internal validity issue is the external validity consideration. So sometimes an intervention works in one context, but it doesn't necessarily apply to all contexts. And we need to be able to continuously test our mechanisms to make sure that we account for any challenges with external validity. We've said this before, but again, I guess another limitation is that RCTs alone are often not enough. So we need to be able to run an implementation or process evaluation or some poll work alongside an RCT to help us get at that how and why that we looked at a moment ago. So ways to randomize. There's a number of different strategies for randomization that we can use in different contexts, and we're now going to dig into these in a little bit more detail. So the first is true randomization, or sometimes called simple randomization. Quite simply means that participants have an equal chance of being allocated to either the intervention or the control group. So we have a sample population and everyone is just randomly allocated to either of those two groups. That's the kind of exactly what it says on the tin version and what we looked at a moment ago in the example. We can also use something called sequential randomization. So this is an option when true or simple randomization isn't available to us. Again, I've probably got some funky examples in here, just trying to think of simple ways to help illustrate it to everyone. So the thing that I thought of here, and hopefully it makes sense, is imagine that we wanted to test the impact of giving people a brochure or a leaflet on supermarket deals or discounts as they enter the store. It would be quite hard to randomize people using simple or true randomization because we don't know when they're going to turn up. We don't even know who they are before they come to the store. We don't have any information on them. So we could use sequential randomization here to quite simply give the first person who enters the store gets a brochure, the second person doesn't, the third person does, the fourth person doesn't, the fifth person does, etc., so on and so forth. And by using sequential randomization, we're trying to basically mimic true randomization because that isn't available to us in this exact example. Very similarly, and linked to that is blocked randomization. So it's the kind of same logic applies, but rather than doing it one on, one off, one on, one off. We just do it in blocks. So maybe the first 3 people get the leaflet or brochure, and the next 3 people don't, the next 3 do, etc. You can see here the introduction of something called a counterbalance check, or that we can kind of counterbalance the randomization. This is kind of quite simply, it should help us improve the rigor of the randomization, given that we're trying to mimic true randomization. So it helps us control for some of the unobservable factors. And the example I could think of here was, imagine that we're using age as the sequential factor. So 20-year-olds go into the control, 21-year-olds go into the intervention, 22-year-olds control, 23-year-olds intervention, etc., etc. In this example, we could introduce a counterbalance check with each decade. So rather than 19, 29, 39-year-olds all receiving the intervention, we can counterbalance it so that people in their 20s get the intervention when they're an odd number, and people in their 30s get the intervention when they're an even number. The point here is that we're trying to minimize what we call a systematic bias. So it might be the case that there's something unobservable that means that 19, 29, and 39-year-olds, which are all ages that are kind of before a landmark birthday, so before the turn of a new decade, it might mean for some reason there's something that makes those people susceptible to our intervention, something unobservable that we can't account for. By deliberately splitting these up, so making it that 19-year-olds do get the intervention but 29-year-olds don't, we are introducing the counterbalance and helping control for that unobservable factor. So now we have a little bit of a problem. Imagine that we have 100 people. The eagle-eyed of you will spot a theme here, which is that there are rarely as many dots as I'm trying to say there are. Quite simply couldn't face 100 dots on one screen. But let's imagine that there's 100 dots here and 100 people, and all of those people or all of those dots fit into different groupings or categories. So on the one end of the spectrum, we've got the very high income earners, these little red dots. And on the other end, we've got what we call the very low income earners. So this example of grey dots. We obviously also have 3 categories in between. If we use simple randomization, or what we call true randomization a moment ago, and we allocate 100 people into groups, it is possible that we end up with groups that are not representative of the different categories of income earners. So if we think that income is an important variable, and that it might impact the intervention that we're observing or the intervention that we're hoping to implement, we have a challenge here, because we need the groups to be representative of all the different income earners in order to ensure that the groups are kind of on average the same. So this brings us to something called stratification, which is basically a solution to that challenge. So simply what it means is that first we gather participants into categories or into groupings of income earners, and we call these so stratas as part of the stratification. So you can see here we've got very high income earners all the way through to very low income earners, and then we randomize one strata at a time. We randomize them equally into the intervention and the control group. So we first stratify to ensure that high income people are evenly distributed into the intervention and control group. So the top row here shows how high income people may be concentrated in group A if we don't use stratification to randomize one strata at a time. And basically what it means is that we're assigning participants at random to the intervention and control groups within each given strata. So we might also have a strata around kind of gender or height or pre-HE attainment. There's a number of things that we could use as strata and include in our stratification. It could also be based, it's obviously quite easy when it's kind of categorical in terms of the different categories of income earners. It could also be a discrete category, so made up of a continuous variable. We might have those that sit above or below the medium height, for instance, or those who attend schools with above or below the average number of students eligible for free school meals. But essentially we do this, we use stratification to ensure that what we call covariates or kind of key characteristics are balanced between the treatment and the control. It's worth noting that stratification helps us understand three things, or it serves three kind of key purposes. So the first is obviously to ensure that any differences in outcome between treatment and control are balanced across groups. The second is that it means that small groups in particular have access, kind of equal access to treatment. So thinking of an example there, we might be particularly interested in mature students, for instance, and we don't want the mature students to be unequally in a treatment or control, so we stratify to make sure they have equal access. The third reason is to allow for subgroup analysis. So it means that we can look at subsamples within our wider population that we're particularly interested in, again, mature learners or perhaps children with experience of social care, any subgroup that we're particularly interested to examine. Linked to stratification is something called balance checks. Again, Sarah will come to this in more detail later. There's a lot of that. Essentially, the goal of a balance check is to indicate whether the randomization has produced a balance on all of these characteristics. So we might decide that gender is an important covariate in one of our trials, and therefore we want the kind of male-female split of pupils to be balanced across treatment and control. And by doing balance checks on each of those covariates, so gender, income, children with experience of social care, we can make sure that it's evened out. So now let's say that our 100 dots that wasn't 100 dots is 100,000 dots that also isn't 100,000 dots. And imagine that we have a really cool intervention. So something that we think is excellent, we're sure it's going to work, maybe we've done prior research, and we're really excited to trial it. It could also be something that's really risky. So it might be a kind of medical intervention, maybe a COVID treatment that we think it carries some risk. The third thing, I guess, is that it could also be expensive. So it might be that we plan to pay students £50 to attend an information, advice and guidance session. And because we're paying them every single student, it like racks up and becomes quite expensive quite quickly. But for now, let's imagine that it's a not so expensive, not so risky, but just a cool intervention. So what we're trying to say is that we have an intervention that we think is really going to work, and then a kind of condition that we think is less likely to work. So here we have an in-person tutoring program versus an online tutoring program, and we're pretty sure that the online tutoring program is going to work. So as I said, perhaps we've done research on this before, or perhaps there's kind of existing evidence to suggest that those who attend the online tutoring program are more likely to have an increase in grades or attainment. I should say this isn't a real example. This is kind of made up, so I don't think we have conclusive evidence on online versus face-to-face tutoring, but let's imagine that we do. So what we're kind of need to consider here, I guess, is that because we're pretty sure that online tutoring is going to work, 50,000 students seems like quite a lot of people to get an intervention that we're actually not sure is the best option. Or as I said on my previous slide, it might be linked more to risk or expense. So 50,000 people is a lot of people to pay to be in control, or 50,000 people is a lot of people to give an intervention that we think carries some risk. So it could be on any of those kind of factors. Again, we have a solution to this kind of challenge, and this is what we call unequal randomization. So one of the things that we can do is change what we call the allocation ratio when randomizing. So rather than everyone having a 50-50 chance of being in a treatment or a control group, in this example here, we're using a kind of 9-to-1 allocation ratio. So 9 people are going to receive the online tutoring program for every 1 that receives the control, so the face-to-face tutoring program. Equally, we can use an unequal randomization to reduce cost or risk, as we've discussed. So this visual is just to help present what we mean by unequal randomization. And it's worth noting that this is also sometimes called powering down a randomized control trial. So we basically reduce that control group But as you can see here, we've got our regular sample population on the left. And when we allocate to treatment and control, we essentially allocate more people to treatment than we do to control, because we have the power and the numbers to be able to do so. And we think it is for some reason beneficial to have more people in the treatment. It is worth noting here that we can also have the inverse converse of this. So we might have a scenario where we are running a program, a tutoring program, a summer school, any intervention that has limited spaces. So we can only randomize into the treatment as far as how many places we have. So if we have 100 places, we can have 100 people in the treatment, and essentially everybody else who applied, who was in our kind of sample population, would then go into the control. So it might be that we end up with a bigger control than we do treatment, but as long as we have allocated the kind of ratio when randomizing, and as long as we're powered to do so, it's not a problem, and an unequal randomization can take place. So our last section on the kind of theory before I hand over to Sarah. And again, I guess it wouldn't be a TASO webinar without one of these questions. So do feel free to kind of drop your thoughts in the chat. But what I would like to know is what all three of these things have in common. So on the far left, we've obviously got cockroaches. In the middle, we've got coconuts. And on the right-hand side, we've got a galaxy. Can anyone tell me what you think these three things have in common? Bearing in mind that we're talking about RCTs. Any thoughts in the chat, let us know. I asked a friend this over the weekend when I was trying to finish off these slides, and they said, you don't want them to fall on you, which I actually think is a really good answer. I wouldn't want a cockroach, a coconut, or a galaxy to fall on me, but it's not the answer we're looking for.
The colour brown, we've had that as a suggestion.
The colour brown is another excellent guess. Yeah, maybe there's multiple correct answers. It's not the answer we're looking for. Any survive a zombie apocalypse? Yeah, that's probably very accurate. A coconut, I think definitely a cockroach in a galaxy. Well, the answer I'm looking for is that they all come in my mind, famous clusters. So we have cockroach clusters for any Harry Potter fans, a type of confectionery in HP. We have coconut clusters, one of the kind of vegan superfoods that I see all the time. And then we have clusters of galaxies. We struggled a bit to find a good third cluster, but I do think galaxies come in clusters. Unsurprisingly, this brings us to cluster RCTs, so the kind of final area of RCTs that we're going to look at. So again, let's start with a kind of scenario or a little thought experiment. What we're looking at here is the impact of happiness, or the impact of presence on happiness. There is actually a wild literature on this that I've discovered. Again, people might know more than I do about it, but let's imagine that we want to understand what happens if we had a family with multiple children in it, and we gave one child loads of presents to try and understand the impact of presents on happiness. So my assumption, or essentially I think the treatment, so giving one child lots of presents, is likely to spill over and impact the other child. So by giving a present to the kid, the child on the left here, it's likely that the child on the right, it looks like his brother is going to get stuck into the fun, might help open the present, is almost certainly going to end up playing with the presents or whatever is inside it. And it's quite hard to isolate the effect of that present on the one child that we're looking at. So this brings us to something that we call the assumption of independence. And there's two parts to the assumption of independence. So the first is that each observation is independent. So each participant is only treated once. An example that I thought of here was, again, in a supermarket, not sure why my head's going there all the time, but imagine that we're trying to test the impact of a public service announcement on a kind of supermarket tannoy. And we randomize the time that we do this. So we make an announcement at 10, we make an announcement at 11, 12, 1, whatever. The problem with this is that it's very possible that someone will be in the supermarket at 10 and still there at 11 doing their weekly shop. And so they would essentially be treated twice by the announcement that's being made. And this would violate the assumption of independence, so people only being treated once. The second thing that we need to consider under this assumption of independence is the spillover. And that's really what we're seeing with the children and the presence here. So the impact of the intervention on one person is going to spill over and impact other people who are close in kind of proximity to them. And therefore, we don't have a true control. So back to our example of the children and the gifts. If we give one child a gift, the other child's going to get stuck in and enjoy the fun. And so what can we do to make sure that we kind of account for or combat this spillover? Well, the kind of most feasible solution, I guess, is that we randomize at the level of the family unit instead of at the level of the child. So rather than giving one child in the family presence, we put that whole family into the treatment or control, and both children as a family unit either do or do not get the presence. We can also do this when thinking about schools as examples. So let's say that we're looking at schools and we're trying to improve teaching quality within a school. Our unit of measurement can't be the school pupil, because a teacher having an impact on one school is likely to, on one pupil is likely to spill over and affect another pupil. So what we end up doing is randomizing at the school level. So you can see here we've got school 1, 2, 3, and 4, and each of these are randomly allocated to either be treatment schools or control schools. Although we're randomizing at the school level, we still measure at the individual level. So we still look at the impact of the individual, so perhaps on attainment or well-being or quality of education. So changing the unit of randomization from individual to the cluster, whatever that cluster is, and in our scenario now, it's just schools. When thinking about cluster RCTs, it's really important to think about variation. So here you can see that one cluster has more variation at the individual level. So you can see the box on the right has different colored dots or more variance in terms of how the dots look. And it's possible for a cluster to have either low variation, and it's also possible for a cluster to have high variation at the individual level. So individual variance is something that's really important to cluster RCTs, but similarly, so is group variance. So on the left-hand side now, we have 4 classrooms or clusters that look quite different to the 4 classrooms or kind of clusters on the right-hand side. Really what I'm trying to illustrate here is that it's possible to have variation both within clusters, but also between separate clusters. So within the cluster, the people might not necessarily be the same. So we might be looking at a school classroom, but all the students or the pupils within that classroom are quite different. But equally, we might have schools that at the meta level look quite different or are quite varied. And then, so when thinking about kind of individual RCTs or RCTs that are randomized at the individual level, we don't typically pay so much attention to this question of variance or this factor of variance. But it is really important when we're thinking about cluster RCTs, and it does come back to this idea of statistical power. So it's important to think about increasing our sample size and kind of increasing the number of clusters that we have for a cluster RCT. So why does all of this matter? And I should say I was definitely relearning this when I was preparing the slides in terms of what we call an ICC, which is a Intracluster Correlation. So similar to power, I think don't be too put off if this feels a bit difficult to understand. It is difficult to understand. Equally, if there's people who have good resources or anyone watching who's more familiar with this, do feel free to drop anything in the chat, because yeah, it is a little complex. But basically, what we are trying to understand when thinking about the ICC is the measure of relatedness of a cluster. So we're looking at the extent to which the variation within a cluster, so within a school, relates to the variation between a cluster, so between the different schools in our unit of randomization. Mathematically, on the right-hand side, all that we're saying here, all this equation is spelling out, is that to get the ICC, so the intracluster correlation, we look at the between cluster variability and we divide that by the sum here at the bottom of the within cluster variability and the between cluster variability together. So this plugs straight into our power calculation for a cluster RCT, and it is an essential part of thinking through whether or not we have enough schools to be able to conduct a rigorous RCT, or if not schools, then whatever our unit, perhaps families with presence. So let's say we have two scenarios. We have 10 schools with 8 pupils on the left-hand side, and we have 4 schools with 16 pupils on the right-hand side. And what we want to know is which one of these scenarios is likely to give us more statistical power or a more rigorous RCT. So it's the school on the left-hand side. It's the 10 schools with 8 pupils. And this is because of a kind of first rule of thumb for variation in cluster RCTs, which is that increasing the number of clusters, so the number of schools, gives us more power than increasing the group size. So 4 schools with more pupils is not actually better than more schools with less pupils. Here we have another scenario. So in the group with lots of dots and lots of variance on the right-hand side, and a group with less variance or less different colored dots on the left-hand side. And again, we want to know which scenario is likely to give us more power. So the answer here is that it's school 2 on the right-hand side, and this brings us to our second rule of thumb, which is that the more people look like each other within a group, the less power we're going to have. So this essentially brings us to a kind of, I guess, a conclusion for cluster RCTs, which is that in general, as a principle, we want lots of small groups that look less like each other. So more clusters with people who are less similar, and we're likely to have more power when conducting our cluster RCT. So to sum up, cluster RCTs, we randomize at the group level, so the kind of unit level, the school, the family, etc., rather than at the individual level. We still measure at the individual level, so we're still looking at the increase in attainment or confidence or sense of belonging per pupil rather than at the school level. And the biggest thing to get our head around is the intracluster correlation. And really what this means is that we're just trying to work out the sum and ratio of the variance between the clusters and within the clusters. That is really the main 3 things we need to know for cluster RCTs. Obviously, it kind of simplifies it in terms of actually how we would conduct one, but they're the 3 principles that we need to be aware of when conducting a cluster RCT. So just to finish off quickly, some examples of where we use clustered RCTs, obviously in schools where we can't randomize individuals, so we do it in classrooms or whole schools. Often used in hospitals or medical trials, so we'll look at different hospitals or different wards within hospitals sometimes. And then credit unions or banks are also used to reduce spillover effects between people that use the same bank or the same system. I think that is the end of you listening to my voice. Bit of a rapid tour. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to ground you in some hopefully easier to understand practical examples of how we have used RCTs with summer schools, and then we'll come to you for a kind of Q&A at the end. So over to you, Sarah.
Sorry to interrupt. I think I'm just going to suggest just a 5-10 minute comfort break if people would like to get go to the loo, get a cup of tea, whatever, and just to say thank you very much, Rain, for that interesting, informative, and extremely good introduction to RCTs. Just to say that we have had some questions in the Q&A in the chat. I think some of those have been picked up already, and I think they're going to be further picked up in Sarah's session when we're looking at the practical side of implementing an RCT in the real world. But we'll come back to them at the end of the session as well. So it's 11:03 now. If you come back, reconvene at 11:10, we'll see you there.
Thanks, Helen.
Hi, hello everyone, welcome back. So I will now pass you over to Sarah, who will be talking about RCTs and summer schools.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thank you, Rain. That was a really good intro and sets us up nicely for this practical example. So I know Rain has used sort of lots of examples throughout her talk, but this is a real life project that we're currently doing on summer schools. So we think it will be helpful just to show you how this actually works in the real world and how to run RCTs in the real world. So Rain is controlling my slides, so hopefully it'll be very smooth, but you might hear me occasionally say, next slide, please, or something of that sort. So let's say to start with, we've got a year 12 summer school that many of you might run yourselves in your various roles at universities or providers. So we've got our summer school that's particularly for year 12 students, that's for their first year in post-16 education, and it has a limited number of places in it. So an advert might go out to colleges or sixth form schools in the area, inviting students to apply to the summer school. And from those groups, you get some students that apply, our group on the left, and some students that choose not to apply. And then we might look at our outcomes for these students. So to see in the end how many of those students that applied and didn't apply actually enrolled in higher education in the future. So we see on the left that those that applied and attended the summer school, we had 80% that enrolled in HE. Whereas if we look at our group that didn't apply, only 50% enrolled in HE. So if we look here, we might say, brilliant, our summer school is doing exactly what it's meant to be doing. Majority of students that are attending are enrolling in HE. So we're doing our job, the summer school's working, all good. But unfortunately, if we did take that conclusion, there would be some problems basically. So there's going to be key differences between these groups. Some might be observable, so these might be to do with gender. So for example, we might find that in our students that attended the summer school, majority of the students were female, and we know from other research that more females are more likely to enroll in HE than males. So perhaps that actually caused the differences in HE enrollment between the two groups. Attainment is a really good example as well. So we might have found that the students that attended the summer school had higher attainment at GCSE, A-level or BTEC. So again, that was the reason why they were more likely to enroll in HE, because they got the grades needed. So there's some sort of really obvious observable or demographic differences, but there's also a bunch of unobservable differences. So for example, we might find that those that applied to the summer school had more family support. They might have had parents themselves who'd gone into HE. They might have had siblings that have just been to HE that really encouraged them to apply. Again, they might be more individually motivated themselves. The fact that they applied to a university summer school implies that they're sort of already interested in HE. So they might have had higher motivation than our group that didn't attend. So there's some really clear differences that we might have missed when we judged on whether our summer school was effective. So yep, just to sort of illustrate that point, as we can see, those who did apply to the summer school, they did have higher attainment than the other group. They did have more family support, and they did have more motivation to enter HE in the first place. So this is why we have to be really careful with sort of making those assumptions based on raw stats. We really need to know what differences might exist between our two groups before we can say that. And this links to something that Rain sort of covered in her introduction, which is that correlation doesn't mean causation. So at the moment, we've got a lot of this sort of type 2 evidence, which is building our understanding on summer schools. It's showing that attending summer school is associated or correlated with more positive attitudes to HE, and in some cases, higher enrollment rates. But what we don't have is this causality. We don't know for sure that it's the summer schools that actually had this impact, rather than sort of key differences that already exist between two groups, which might make them more likely to attend HE in the first place. So we need this sort of type 3 evidence to uncover the fuller picture. And that's where our summer schools project comes in. So we want to try and assess the impact of university summer schools. This current evidence that we've got is very much lying in the type 2 section. So we've got this limited evidence on causality. That's what we really want to do. We've also got limited evidence that actually links summer schools to our behavioural outcomes. So a lot of the evidence out there at the moment is linking summer schools to attitudes or confidence levels. So we're really missing this behavioural outcome on the impact on HE enrolment rates. So that's what we're trying to uncover with our own summer schools evaluation. So the project, delighted to see that we've got some of our project partners here. I noticed in our attendees. So I hope I do this description justice as you're all watching. But thanks for coming along. So we've got multiple university partners in this project, some of which run summer schools aimed at pre-16 students. So these will be year 9 or year 10 students, and some that run summer schools aimed at post-16 students. So these will be year 12, like the example I just used. So sort of first year of post-16 education. So we actually started this project some time ago, and it started looking at summer schools that were taking place in the summer of 2021. So as we know, we were in the midst of a pandemic then, and unfortunately this meant that summer schools had to be delivered online, which we know isn't normal practice. So what we've actually done is an extension of the project. So we're also going to be looking at summer schools which take place this year in a face-to-face residential setting so that we can measure normal practice and the impact on HE enrolment. Because we have our online project going on as well, it's quite nice that we can do a sort of comparison of online delivery versus face-to-face delivery. And with our summer school partners, the usual way that I'm sure most people are familiar with, that they'll allocate their places to a summer school is through a ranking system. So on the whole, summer schools will be oversubscribed. So you'd have a set number of places, perhaps 150 places on your summer school, but you might get 250 students that apply. So not everyone that applies, can get a place. So what universities or providers tend to do normally is they'd apply a ranking system. So they might put students that maybe meet 2 or 3 widening participation criteria. They ensure that they have places and they rank students. And then once they've filled their places, they cut that off, and then anyone else that's applied that doesn't meet any criteria doesn't get a place, basically. But the problem with this is that we end up with 2 groups who look very different from each other. And as Rain was alluding to earlier, we need to make sure that we've got balanced groups. So if we were doing it the usual way, we might find that those who attend the summer school have particular characteristics, whereas those who don't, our control group, those who haven't been allocated a place, don't have particular characteristics. So this is why we've needed to change the methods for this project to ensure that what we're doing creates balanced groups, which is where our randomization comes in. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got summer schools that are oversubscribed. So this is the way that we can allow this RCT to take place. We need to have a level of oversubscription, and the level of oversubscription really depends on how many applicants you've got and the number of places that you've got. So that really determines the size of your treatment group who receive a place and your control group that don't. So what our university partners have done is they've provided a list to us of eligible applicants. So they've made sure that the list they provide to us is only full of students that actually meet some sort of widening participation criteria. So you'll all be reasonably familiar, I'm sure, with these. So they might be from a particular quintile, which represents that they're underrepresented in terms of going to HE. It might be a quintile of deprivation. It might be that they're care experienced, or they're from a particular minority ethnic group. So there's lots of different widening participation criteria, and universities will make sure that the list they provide to us only includes students that sort of meet some sort of criteria. So essentially, they need to be comfortable that any of the students they provide to us could receive a place. They need to be happy that they could receive a place. And then what we will do is, oh, sorry, one slide before, Rain. I'm going slower. So what we'll do is we will actually randomly allocate. So we've actually got the Behavioural Insights team on this project. There are external evaluators on the project, and they do these things like the randomization. I did see a comment perhaps in the chat or in the Q&A around how the randomization actually takes place. So the way that it's done with the Behavioural Insights team is they do it using a particular type of statistical software. But it is something that you can do in Excel as well, and we'd certainly be happy to provide a bit more guidance on how you can do that. But essentially, you're allocating a student either a 0 or a 1, and it's done completely randomly. So if they receive a 1, it means they get a place on the summer school. If they receive a 0, it means they don't. So it is just completely random. But obviously, it does depend on the size of your summer school. So as Rain was saying earlier, you might have unequal groups because depending on the number of students that apply, you might have more students in your treatment group that receive a place compared to your control group, or vice versa. So what Rain was talking about earlier as well is something called balance checks. So we want to make sure that our students in each of our treatment and control group have the same sort of or similar characteristics. So by randomization, which was what Rain was sort of saying with the law of large numbers, you're likely to have quite balanced groups anyway between your treatment and control. But what we can do as well is something called balance checks. So this is an example coming straight from our summer school project, and it will tell you what the mean number, the average number is for each variable that you've got. So in this example, a male student was coded as a 0 and a female student was coded as a 1. So we can see that our average numbers here are reasonably similar. Slightly more females are applying than males, but it means in our treatment and control group, we've got roughly the same amount of females. This column on the right, which represents p-value, is looking at significance. So if this p-value was significant, so lower than 0.05, then it means that there's significant difference between our treatment and control groups. That's what we don't want, but we can see here that none of our p-values are at that level. So it means on the whole, we're fairly evenly distributed between our treatment and control groups. Obviously, not all of our variables are included here, but we've looked at things like ethnicity, what IMD or polar quintile they come from, the proportion of students who receive free school meals or have a family history of HE. So for example, their parents or carers went to HE. And we also look at some prior attainment, so the number of top grades in each group. So these are all things which might impact our overall outcome, and we just want to make sure that they are balanced between the treatment and control group before we sort of go ahead, which is what they are. And that's what randomization really helps us do, is make sure that these groups are balanced rather than sort of the usual ranking system where they aren't balanced. So Rain touched on this a little bit earlier as well, which is our theory of change. So even though we're doing a randomized controlled trial, it's a robust method, it's a more complicated method, we still need to make sure that the whole project is grounded in this theory of change. So we have, I'm going to go through it sort of step by step, not in a huge amount of detail, but just to show what we're expecting the summer school to change. So the situation that we've got at the moment, obviously, is that we have some students from disadvantaged and unrepresented backgrounds are less likely to enroll in HE than their peers. So obviously our aim of our summer school then is to increase access and participation to HE for these disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. Which brings us on to the impact of our summer school. So the outcomes we want from our summer school are that we want students to see HE as a more desirable option. We want them to be more confident in their ability. We want them to have the info they need to make an informed decision about their future. and we want them to develop a sense of belonging in an HE setting. So that's what we want the outcomes of our summer school to be, which then leads to our impact, which are that students are more likely to apply to HE, more likely to enroll in HE, and if they're doing this particular subject summer school, more likely to progress to a specific subject in HE. And to achieve that impact, we need particular activities. So again, these might be familiar to you in terms of what a summer school could be made up of: a campus tour, actually staying overnight in accommodation, various information and guidance sessions, some subject tasters, for example, lectures of particular subjects, Q&As with current university students and other group work so that they can get to know their sort of fellow summer school attendees as well. And then our outputs here, what's actually physically happening and what we can control here is that students experience that HE setting, students are exposed to different subjects, they're able to interact with other students. So whether that be students actually attending the summer school, but also current university students. And that's what we're hoping is going to build this sort of sense of belonging in an HE setting. And then we look at the input. So what do we need to ensure that this process, or make it more likely that this process is happening? So we obviously need staff time, we need resources, we need our student ambassadors, we need to make sure accommodation is available, we need to make sure we're advertising the summer schools correctly, and that we can collect data that we need to make sure that we can measure its impact. And then finally, we have a certain rationale and assumptions. So based on previous research, we know that summer schools are positively associated with particular outcomes related to HE. So that's sort of our rationale as to why we're carrying out this study. But we also need key assumptions to be met. So we need to make sure the summer school goes ahead. We need to make sure students are taking part, that they're engaged, that they attend, and that they're supported to engage from particular staff. So that's a very sort of whistle-stop tour of a theory of change, but it's just really important to flag that you need this when you're doing any evaluation. You need to make sure it's grounded in a strong theory of change. Okay, so we've randomized our two groups. So we've got our treatment group that have received a place on the summer school, and then we've got our control group that don't receive a place on the summer school. So ultimately, we want to measure the difference in these two groups, and that will actually give us the causal estimate of summer schools, or the impact of summer schools. So there's two elements of outcome data that we're going to be looking at. The first is measured by a survey. So these are sort of our intermediate outcomes. So these are ones that we've talked about previously. So attitudes towards HE or confidence in applying to HE, things like that are measured through a survey. The second one, though, is our behavioural outcome. And this is what I was saying that we're sort of lacking in the evidence at the moment. So we need more evidence that links summer schools to behavioural outcomes. And here our behavioural outcome is enrolment in HE. So actually being accepted into higher education and attending. And we track this via the Higher Education Access Tracker, which hopefully a lot of you are familiar with, but all of our universities in our summer schools program are signed up to HEAT and can track students basically to see if they are enrolling in HE, both the treatment and the control group, and we'll do a comparison to see are summer schools leading to more positive attitudes, and are summer schools leading to greater enrolment in HE, because that's what we want. So just to give you a little idea of the survey, we've tried to keep the survey pretty short to try and increase response rates. And we also made sure that the survey is the same for our online summer schools and also for our face-to-face summer schools. So we're using the same survey measures for both parts of the project. And this survey is actually administered before the summer school takes place. It's administered again after the summer school takes place. And then we have a final question, question 7, have you applied to university? And this is asked in January in line with the UCAS deadlines, but only for post-16 summer schools. So there's a few things that we're looking to measure. The obvious sort of how likely are you to apply to HE? but also around confidence in making a successful application and succeeding at university. Question 4 is sort of this sense of belonging link. So linking university with their social identity. Do they believe that university is for them? And then also a perception of practical barriers. So do they believe they can afford to go? Do they know how to apply? So a lot of the sessions that are covered within a summer school are around personal statements, applying to university, student finance. So these are all sort of measures that we're hoping to achieve through the summer school. So I just wanted to touch briefly on ethical considerations, because this is something we definitely get asked a lot. And I know Rain touched on this briefly earlier. But there's of course this idea of equipoise, which Rain mentioned earlier. So at the moment, we don't have this really strong causal evidence that summer schools are actually effective. Obviously, we hope they are, and we know universities have been running summer schools for a long time. But because we don't have this concrete type 3 evidence, this means that it gives us more reason to run this sort of RCT. But also, it's the fact that summer schools are oversubscribed anyway. There's no way this RCT would work if summer schools aren't oversubscribed. It just wouldn't be possible. So essentially, we're just using randomization as another method of allocating places. Arguably, it could be a fairer method because it is just completely random rather than selecting students. But it only really works if students have, if we've got enough students essentially applying, which might not always be the case, particularly during COVID. We found that was the case last time. But what's really important as well is that students are aware they're taking part in an RCT. Obviously, we know that can cause issues that Ray mentioned earlier in terms of students being aware and maybe behaving differently, but we need to make sure that students are aware that this RCT is happening and what it means for them. So there is, it has to go through ethical approval to get this study off the ground, and students are provided with a participant information sheet, and they're able to opt out if they don't want to be a part of the study, if they don't want us to track their data long term to see if they enter HE, if they don't want us to contact them for surveys, they can choose to opt out, and we won't include any of their data and we won't contact them further. So RCTs in the real world are very different to our sort of lab-based RCTs that happened at the start. So where we can control everything, it's very different in the real world, and things can go wrong, and things did indeed go wrong last year in our project, and I'm sure they'll go wrong this year as well. But the good thing is that we have knowledge now, we have efforts to try and tackle some of the issues that we know could come up. So the first one, which I've sort of already alluded to, is that it's completely reliant on applicant numbers. So if certain summer schools, certain universities do not have the numbers, do not have enough applicants, it means they can't take part in the RCT. And unfortunately, we did have some university partners last year where that was the case. They thought they would get a lot more applicants, but unfortunately, because of COVID and the context sort of surrounding that, it meant that applicant numbers weren't as high and they couldn't be part of the RCT. There's also really sort of particular nuances which happen. So for example, some universities have particular protected groups. So for a lot of them, it might have been care leavers or care experienced students. They want to make sure that these students get a place. And because they tend to come in small numbers in terms of applicants, this was something that we could be quite flexible on. So we could say, yep, okay, if anyone that applies that's a care leaver, we will automatically allocate them to the treatment group, they'll receive a place. But it does mean that their data wouldn't be included in our actual analysis and in the final report, because the fact that they've been allocated straight to the treatment group means that we can't look at their data and we won't have equal numbers in the control group and things like that. But it does mean in small numbers, when universities are concerned that they really want to protect these groups and guarantee students a place, that they can do. There's also sort of quite particular constraints around, particularly it seems to be around wanting a 50-50 gender split. and also issues with accommodation. So this has become apparent this year with our face-to-face summer schools. Some universities need to fill particular rooms. They might only be allowed males in a particular corridor. They're not allowed to mix with females, so it has to be quite separate. So these are sort of things that we've needed to factor in terms of the randomization. So as much as possible, we've been tried to ensure that there's a sort of equal gender split, but it does really depend on the number of applicants that apply. I'm sure you're all quite familiar, and I think I saw a comment in the chat as well, which is that more females tend to apply than males. So it makes it more difficult to do this sort of 50-50 split, but as much as possible, we'll try and make sure it's balanced and that the actual experience of students on the summer school isn't impacted by having, you know, an overwhelming number of females compared to males. There's also this problem that you'd have students that apply to more than one summer school. So that was actually more common than we thought would be in the trial. So we might have a student apply to one summer school that's up north, but also apply to a summer school in London. And I guess because the summer schools were online, this made it more possible and more probable. But we really don't want that to happen, and this is what sort of Rain was going through earlier in her supermarket example. So we don't want students to be treated twice. We don't want students to attend more than one summer school. So this meant we had to look through the data quite carefully. We had to do duplicate checking if students applied to more of the one summer school on the list, and they would be randomly allocated to only be considered for one of the summer schools. And this was explained to the students. Of course, they might have applied to summer schools outside of the trial, but within the trial, we could at least make sure that they were only sort of part of the RCT for one summer school, not more than one. Which kind of brings me on to this point on sort of lack of control. So we know that students are likely to have been involved in more activities rather than just the summer school. They might be involved in additional outreach activities. They might have applied to summer schools outside of the trial that we can't control there. But that's quite the good thing about RCTs here, is that we know that both our treatment and control group are exposed to the same sort of availability there of outreach activities. And we can also track what they're doing, again, using the Higher Education Access Tracker. Using HEAT, we can see, okay, so did our control group actually access a lot of other outreach activities which may have informed their decision to apply to HE? And it's things that we can sort of factor in to our interpretation of the results as well. So it's important that we collect that data. And alongside our RCT, we also carry out an implementation and process evaluation. So this is again something that Rain touched on earlier. But it's really important that we flag here that we do use mixed methods approaches. So the RCT will very much show what has worked, but what the IPE will do is show us how and why the summer school did or didn't work. So it really gives us a lot more information that we wouldn't get from the RCT alone, and it's important that they're sort of done in conjunction. So we can really sort of interrogate the mechanisms of how the summer school brought about change. We can look at the context in particular. So obviously COVID was a huge player in the context, but also we might look at why the summer school works for some groups better than it does for other groups. In terms of fidelity, this means we're looking at, oh, sorry. Can anyone hear me? I've lost everyone.
We can hear you, Sarah.
Yeah.
We
can hear you.
Oh no, everything's frozen. Oh, okay, sorry, you're back. I'm so sorry. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yeah, we've got you.
Oh, phew. Oh, that was terrifying. Oh, okay, sorry, I'm back. My heart is going very quickly now. Sorry, so where was I? So hopefully you heard the context, but then moving on to fidelity. So was it the summer school actually implemented as planned? So did everything go according to plan? Were all the essential elements included in the summer school? We can look at engagement. So this is kind of around dosage, and this was really interesting in an online context because summer school providers had to sort of decide what constituted engagement, which is a bit more difficult in an online setting. So how many sessions did they need to attend? Did they have to be synchronous or asynchronous? Did they have to complete a certain assignment to actually mean that they attended the summer school? This year with face-to-face summer schools, it's slightly easier as, I mean, you might have the odd student dropping out partway through, but on the whole, they're sort of either attending the summer school or they're not. But we can also look a lot more carefully on the effect on students. So again, Ray mentioned this earlier through sort of qualitative methods. So we can hold interviews and focus groups with students and actually get down more to the sort of nitty-gritty of the summer school and the impact it had on them. Look at key themes which seem to be consistent across students, or perhaps were different depending on the characteristics of students. And yeah, just really delve into the context of COVID, for example, what made them apply to the summer school, how did they find it online in the context of COVID, how their decisions have been impacted in the future because of that. So the IPE gives us a lot more information that we can use alongside the RCT to give us some more information and sort of produce a more robust report which covers all of these elements. So I wanted to take a little opportunity here just to provide some early findings on the Summer Schools project. We are actually going to be reporting on the Summer Schools project reasonably soon. The report is just coming together at the moment, but we do have some early findings from the analysis that I just wanted to talk you through while we have the opportunity. So it's worth flagging that the early findings now are only to do with our survey outcomes. Because of when students are able to apply to higher education and enroll in higher education, it means that we won't get that data until next year or the year after if we're talking about the current study at the moment. But for our online summer schools, it will be next year. So at the moment, we just have these survey outcomes that I just talked you through for a little while. So this table shows what the mean score was on the survey scales, and on the left it tells you what the actual survey scale was, the number of students that responded to the survey, and how many points on the scale it was. So we can see here for the first question, so how likely are you to apply to HE? Really interestingly, the mean was exactly the same for our intervention group and our control group. So it essentially means that regardless of whether they got a place on the summer school or not, they were very much interested in going to HE. And I guess this makes sense here because we know students are applying to a university summer school, so likely they've already got that sort of high interest in going to higher education in the first place. The next question we asked was only to pre-16 students, so these year 9 and year 10 students, and here we were asking what was the likelihood of them progressing to academic post-16 study. And interestingly here, it was marginally higher, so marginally more positive for our control group. But it's worth flagging here, it was only a really small sample of students that actually answered this survey question. So as sort of Rain talked through earlier, in terms of power, we can't be that confident in the actual effect here because it's such a small sample size. But yeah, again, worth noting the interest. Whereas our final sort of 4 survey outcomes, we can see that the intervention group did respond a bit more positively. So particularly in regards to self-efficacy, so this was their confidence in relating to applying to HE and succeeding in HE. It was higher in our students who actually received a place on the summer school. Again, our sort of sense of belonging measure or compatibility with social identity, this was again higher for our intervention group. And again, in terms of perception of practical barriers, so did students believe they could afford to go to university? Did students believe that they could apply or know how to apply to university? And again, this was higher for students that received a place on the summer school. And then our final measure which, as I mentioned earlier, was asked in January in line with the UCAS deadline. So here we were just saying, have you applied to HE? Basically, have you applied to university? So again, you can see it's very high. So 94% of students in our intervention group, so those who had a place, said that they had applied to HE, compared to 91% in our control group. So again, it's both levels are really high. So that kind of alludes to, or very much aligns with our first question. So they were both very likely to apply to HE, and again, when they actually reported on whether they'd applied, it would still remain consistently high, but marginally higher for those that had a place. It's worth noting here that none of these were statistically significant. So although we can see it's a small positive effect of the summer school, none of these were actually significant. A lot of that is down to sample size. Unfortunately, response rates were lower than we would have liked in terms of the surveys. I think this shows the importance here of sort of behavioural outcomes, because when we're doing our long-term tracking to see whether students do indeed enrol in HE, we're actually looking at behavioural outcomes. We don't need to ask students. We're not relying on response rates. So it means we'll have a much higher sample, which gives us more power and more confidence in the results. So I saw, sorry, briefly, I know we were going to address questions at the end, but someone mentioned whether this is based on pre and post. So yeah, it's exactly that. It's using both our baseline survey and our post-summer school survey to see the impact on our treatment and control group. So that's what the overall results are showing. And obviously it does go into a bit more detail on that in terms of the report. I'm just sort of showing you some very high-level early findings at this point. But this graph just helps to sort of illustrate what I was just talking about. So essentially, the likelihood of going to HE remains very much in the middle, because there was no difference really between our treatment and control group. Whereas our four sort of other survey items here, we can say are sliding more to the positive side of the scale, because it's showing, if you were in the treatment group, so if you were had a place on the summer school, you are more likely to be more confident of your chances in HE, more likely to have a sense of belonging there, and to believe you could overcome practical barriers, as well as more likely to have actually reported you are applying. I don't want to get too bogged down in the sort of statsy bits here, as I know we don't have much time left, but these sort of lighter green dots here, they show the confidence intervals, and this is where sample size is really important. So you can see, for example, this likelihood of progressing to academic study post-16, the confidence interval here is really, really wide, and this is because our sample size was so small here. So it just means essentially the true result could lie anywhere between the points. Obviously, it's more likely that it lies where the point is now, but it's just showing that we can't be that confident of the results because the sample size was so small in that case. So you can see the confidence intervals are a little bit smaller in the other sections, but they are in some cases still crossing sort of this line of zero. So it does mean ultimately that the results could be positive or negative, but we're reasonably certain at this point that it's a small positive effect on the majority of those outcomes, which is promising and a nice sort of proxy measure till we can actually measure enrolment into HE. So just final slide from me. I just wanted to flag what's coming soon, really. So as I mentioned there, we are due to be publishing our report on the intermediate outcomes very soon, which will sort of go through those survey outcomes, but also give you all the findings from the IPE, the implementation and process evaluation. So some really interesting findings from there. All of our university partners did focus groups and interviews with students. So there's some really interesting findings there that will be out in our report in the summer. But we'll also get our HE entry data next year. So we'll have a final report for our online summer schools next year. And we'll also look at attainment data as well, because we know that's a key outcome, particularly for pre-16 students, where it's so far until they're actually be able to apply to HE. So at this point, we can at least look at their attainment data and their GCSE grades. And then for our face-to-face summer schools, sorry, Rain, you just need to click one more. So for our face-to-face summer schools project, so the summer schools will be taking place this summer. It therefore means we won't get our intermediate outcomes until next year. So similar time as this year, but this time next year, it again will be the survey outcomes and the IPE findings, and then the following year for our HE entry data and attainment data. So in 2 years' time, we'll have some more sort of solid evidence from 2 RCTs on the impact of summer schools on enrolling into HE. And that's it for my practical example. I think I've seen quite a few questions coming in, so I'll hand you back to our chair, Helen.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yes, we do have a fair few questions. Oh, is it a 12 p.m. finish or 12:15 finish? Just to keeping an eye on time.
I think it's scheduled till 12:15.
Okay, brilliant. Right, I'm going there, as Sarah said, there are a fair few questions here. Rain, I'm going to, there's one for you first of all, which is on survey validation and whether this was a set of survey validated questions.
Yeah, great question. So the answer is kind of yes and kind of no. The scales that we used in the example that Sarah just talked you through are not fully validated. So this was kind of set up in the early days of TASO, and they're not kind of full subscales pulled from wider validated scales. However, we are currently developing and validating a bunch of scales to fix this exact problem. So I'm sure this question came from kind of the knowledge that people use quite varied survey items and subscales, and it makes it hard to compare results between studies and across studies. And to remedy that, we are producing what we're kind of thinking of as a WP, both access and success, like bespoke survey bank. So it will have a bunch of different constructs, things like academic self-efficacy, sense of belonging, kind of growth mindset, all the key constructs that we think are important in this space, and we are validating scales so that you can all measure those in the same way and know that you are understanding the construct that you want to understand. That project will report in September, October this year, so hopefully those scales will be available to use for the next academic term.
Great, thank you very much, Ray. Hope that answered the question. Sarah, this is one for you, and I think you have touched on this, but there's a question about whether this is blind, a blind kind of RCT, or whether students know which group they've been allocated to, whether treatment or control.
Yeah, so it's not a blind study in the sense that students are told when they are applied to a summer school, any of the university summer schools that we're partnered with, they will be told straight away before they apply, you know, that they're taking place in a study, that whether they receive a place on the summer school is down to randomization, but they can opt out of the study if they want. So yeah, it's not blind in that sense, because students know if they've received a place that means they're in the treatment group. So there's no way to be blind here in terms of what group they're in. But yeah, as I said, in terms of ethics, it does mean students can opt out if they don't want us to actually look at their data and include their data in our reports. But otherwise they will be involved in the study.
I think, I'm not sure, this might have been answered. I've got a question here about whether the numbers are 50-50 or bunched together. Was it 295 students who applied all together?
Sorry, I'm not sure exactly what the 295 was relating to. Perhaps maybe the number of students in the survey outcomes. But yeah, essentially, sorry, I should have touched on this in a bit more detail. But it, as Rain was sort of talking to in her part of the section, it is completely stratified depending on the university. So we don't randomize all together, we randomize per university. So we have a set number of students that apply to one of the university summer schools, and then by university we would randomly allocate. So the size of the treatment and control group really depends on how many applicants you've got from that university, and how many places you've got from that university as well. So it's stratified at the university level or the institutional level, but it was also stratified at the subject level. So some universities had multiple subject summer schools going on. So they might have had a biosciences summer school, they might have had a psychology summer school, a medicine summer school, like a huge range of different options. So the randomization had to be stratified further at subject level, depending on which subject the students had applied to. So that really determined the numbers there. But yeah, in terms of the survey numbers that we were talking about, the response rates there, it was asked to everyone, treatment and control, so all students that were in the study and didn't choose to opt out. And so that number is just a collated number of students, basically. And as you'd expect, response rates for the treatment group were higher than for the control group. So that's why we have to be a little bit careful with survey findings there. And it does go into a lot of detail in the report that will be published, which is why our sort of main primary outcome will be the behavioural measure of enrolment into HE.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. There's another question, and we have touched on this around the ethics of conducting our RCTs, and particularly when we're working with disadvantaged groups. But as Sarah was saying, for example, in the case of the summer schools, it's an intervention that is oversubscribed. So in a way, it's allocating a place. Randomization is another way of allocating a place, because not everybody will receive a place anyway. And as Sarah said, there are those groups who are protected, particularly the smaller subgroups of students, where we're obviously within the RCT we are very happy, and we have the ability to include those groups. Rain, did you want to add something in addition to the point?
Aside from the kind of practical implications of how we randomize and who gets allocated to treatment and control, the other point that I was going to raise is this point of equipoise, which I kind of skimmed over quite quickly when thinking about the pros and cons of RCTs, but I think it's maybe worth just coming back to and explaining in a bit more detail. So when we talk about equipoise in the context of evidence and also in ethics, really what we mean is, equipoise is the idea that there's balance. So we don't really know whether or not the evidence is tipped to being kind of causal and it works, or causal and it doesn't work. So we're kind of on this like even playing field where we don't really know, based on existing evidence and research, whether or not something works. In this case, it's a summer school. So as Sarah was pointing out earlier, we have some kind of emerging empirical evidence for summer schools, but it's largely based on attitudes and aspirations, and we don't often observe this behavioural outcome. And because we don't know whether or not a summer school works, we also don't know whether someone being allocated to a treatment is going to be kind of disadvantaged by not receiving the summer school. And as we saw in some earlier examples, sometimes the control group actually do better than the treatment group, if the kind of theory behind our change is inaccurate or incorrect for anyway. So in an ethics application, quite literally, if you're thinking about applying for ethics to your research ethics committee to conduct a summer school, the point of equipoise is just a really important one to highlight. If you're conducting research in order to produce causal evidence that doesn't currently exist, then it's a helpful rationale or approach to include in your ethics application.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rain. I have been made aware that actually the session finishes at 12 p.m. and we're at 11:59. So my suggestion is that we've had some really, really good questions, some really interesting questions. My suggestion is that we pick those up and we respond to them in an email, and perhaps part of an FAQ sheet, but we will answer those and circulate the answer to the questions when we circulate the recording of the webinar, because there's definitely far too many to get through. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed to Rain and Sarah for that illuminating presentation, and thank you very much to everyone who joined us, and hopefully see you at either at our face-to-face conference, our conference which is on Thursday, or at some of our online sessions which we're running this week. Okay, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
You.